Hello, I'm Bob the Booker and welcome to my channel. And in honour of my nonsense project to keep going through the old Booker shortlist, I shouldn't deride it, I actually do enjoy it. But as part of my project to go back through the old Booker Prize shortlists, this is 1983 and me looking at the books that were shortlisted that year. And it's interesting as well, just as a side point before I start talking about the books themselves. It's an interesting shortlist in the sense that we only have one woman, Anita Mason, but actually like three women on the jury. And obviously it doesn't necessarily mean like for like, right? It doesn't mean that women are always going to pick books by women. It doesn't mean men are always going to pick books by men. But it's just sort of interesting, and it's quite an interesting set of people as the judges that year. It was chaired by Faye Weldon, who recently passed away, a British writer who writes these really comical and absurd books, and yeah, like really very witty, very funny books, and in some degree that shows up a little bit in some of the shortlist. And then also Angela Carter, a personal favourite of mine. So really interesting to see what kind of comes with the books that are in this shortlist. Starting first with the winner, we have J.M. Coetzee with Life and Times of Michael K. Firstly, I adore this book. I think it's very, very good. Coetzee is a writer where every time I read something of his, I'm like, oh, I just get to a point where I'm like, you clever, I want to swear, but you get what I mean. I'm just sort of frustrated by how clever he is, because you think that he's doing something else entirely and he kind of just pulls the rug from underneath you slightly. And The Life of Times of Michael K., his first win, he later went on to win again with Disgrace, I think is just such a phenomenal book in so many ways. It tells the story of this kind of almost everyday man, Michael K., who is trying to escape under these quite difficult situations. There's a sort of civil war going on. He is trying to go from Cape Town to another town, and in all of that he is just sort of constantly, a threat of being discovered or being found, and what will come next from him. But then the K bit, as someone who is a big fan of Kafka, I was like, oh, what are we doing here? And actually it does, I think there is some kind of Kafka-esque reference of, the kind of intentional not naming of things. So this, the war is fictional. The town he's going to, I think maybe gets mentioned. I can't remember exactly if it does. But the K that keeps on appearing in his name is this sort of sign of this sort of Kafka-esque journey. And what I think I found really captivating about the way that this story moves is that there's so much brutality, but he is allowed to be this sort of slightly odd character who doesn't really fit with everything going on. There's all this war and kind of this sort of politicking around him, and he's a character who almost doesn't understand it. He just wants to make a little journey from one place to another, and I found him absolutely captivating as a character. And also just Coetzee just has this way of writing where I kind of don't really care what the story is about. I'm just completely sold by the telling. And so it's just a really bizarre and interesting book, and really brutal, and I think absolutely makes sense as a winner here. I think this is a very, very good book. And actually we'll come to it when we talk about another shortlisted book, but this almost didn't win. Shame by Salman Rushdie almost won here. And actually we will, it's interesting because part of the conversation was also about the fact that Salman Rushdie had won 2 years before with Midnight's Children, and is that too much to sort of suddenly have a second winner again? And actually Disgrace, when Coetzee wins in 99, had similar conversations about, can we give a win to somebody for a second time? So it comes up, it goes in circles. These things always go in circles in Booker lore and Booker history. But anyway, a fantastic book, I think, nonetheless. Next up, we have Malcolm Bradbury with Rates of Exchange. And this is a book that is kind of a bit absurd and silly in many ways, but the character, our kind of doctor at the heart of it, Angus Petworth, he travels to a fictional sort of post-Soviet nation, or so I think it is actually during the Soviet times, but it's kind of unnamed, and it's sort of meant to be, I think, almost a bit of a like a kind of hodgepodge of various sort of Frankensteined European nations in this sense. It's sort of pan-Eastern Europe. And I think in some ways that's part of the book's appeal, that it kind of plays around with this fictional idea. I think it's also partly a bit of the book's downfall, because it's aged quite weirdly to sort of be like, those funny Eastern European nations with unpronounceable words. And it's a bit like, okay, this joke feels quite tired now as a modern reader. But regardless, so this is a slightly absurd book of him trying to move through the landscape, and he's meant to be delivering lectures, and all of that gets kind of thrown into disarray because of the Iron Curtain and all these sorts of the kind of rules and laws around things. So he's sort of constantly an outsider in this world, where he's constantly trying to decode the language, and we as the audience get to play around and sort of decode the language with him. But equally, we just sort of watch as he falls upwards for most of the book. And that's the kind of core idea, is he's meant to be sort of trapped and kind of in this very difficult world. And in many ways he still is, but he also still does well. He's kind of protected by his status to some degree. It's a very weird book. It's kind of fun, but again, I suppose in some ways has aged quite weirdly, but still, a very classic kind of bit of British humour in that sense, of sort of, which, I mean, most British humour sort of really originates from xenophobia, it seems, at least in regards to this book. But here it's that kind of classic sort of like, oh, I'm a sort of Brit abroad in an uncertain landscape, and how will I survive? And it does sort of make some more intelligent points as well. I'm probably giving it short shrift here. It does do a few other clever things in terms of analysing the main character's lack of understanding of the world. He's not particularly compassionate about the world that he's in. He doesn't really seek to understand in a lot of cases, and I think the narrator, the kind of narrative voice, pulls him up on it as well. So it still addresses that, but it's kind of interesting where this book lands with it. Next up, we have Flying to Nowhere by John Fuller, and probably one of the shortest books that we've almost ever had probably be shortlisted for the Booker. John Fuller is typically a poet, and that shows quite strongly, I think, in this book, because it has a kind of precision of a poet to it in so many ways. And so really it's kind of difficult to almost explain what this book is at times, because at times it almost just feels like a sort of non-fiction book about a miracle that happened. But it largely is sort of focused around a remote Welsh island. There are people sort of searching to try and understand what's happening in this world. And so it's this sort of slightly dreamlike book that kind of goes into these sorts of areas of the story. It's quite a weird one. I didn't always get on with it. I think I found it kind of floated a bit and then ended. But I think there's also a lot of beauty in it as well. It's a tricky one, because sometimes on a sentence level, I thought parts of this book were really gorgeous. I think I kind of got to the end and felt a bit unfulfilled. Maybe because of the length of the book, maybe because, I don't know, I wasn't necessarily that sold by the story. But I think nonetheless, it's quite an interesting quirk of sort of Booker shortlists, that you get books like this that sort of break through, where clearly the judges loved it enough to put it there, and it has this sort of it sort of fleshes out the rest of the shortlist in a really interesting way. It gives a bit of variety to what otherwise would be a very a slightly different shortlist. So yeah, I really enjoyed this in some ways and really struggled with various other parts of it. But I'm still glad that I read it, I guess, is the longer thing. The book does this sort of, has a few passages of floating through and kind of really thinking about theology and various parts of liturgy and all these other things. It's really interesting in that sense, but then it kind of just ended, and I was like, oh, okay, well, okay. But nonetheless, one of those interesting quirks, nonetheless. Next up, we have Anita Mason with The Illusionist. And I sort of spoke about this a few months ago, I think, maybe in a weekly wrap-up. It's a book that largely focuses, I mean, a lot of these books, I will say, well, at least 3 of them kind of focus, I know, yeah, 2 or 3 of them focus on quite like medieval, old historical kind of points in time. And The Illusionist is an odd one. It focuses sort of particularly on an illusionist, as you may guess, and there's a sort of odd wrap, sort of it's sort of all wrapped up with things around like religion and kind of sorcery and being kind of other. And it takes some weird angles where it kind of goes down these sort of very either religious or kind of fantastical lines. But actually at the heart of it was also really quite funny in parts. It talks a lot about this sort of almost the kind of drudgery as well of being this sort of magician character, and the kind of the oddness of being a magician in an area or in a time where you'd sort of be cast out as like an evil witch figure, and kind of people around you would want to destroy you. And increasingly that makes sense given that Faye Weldon and Angela Carter are 2 of the judges, because actually their sort of very specific sense of humor, of a taste for the absurd and a taste for the sort of the mundane, the absurdity of the mundane and the mundanity of the absurd, I think is really at show here. So I actually overall really enjoyed the book. I thought it did a lot of things quite interestingly. It really plays around with this story of this character who's trying to get somewhere in this sort of magic world, and is kind of in some ways at the intersection of various bits of history and all these other things. But yeah, it's a very strange shortlist increasingly as we go. Next, we have Salman Rushdie with Shame. And this is not me claiming that there's sort of some riggery going on in the judging panel, but it is worth noting Angela Carter and Salman Rushdie were really close friends. And she admittedly is sort of, I don't think, you know, she laid her cards on the table, I think, with this. But what I find really interesting about their friendship is that she, you know, there are these sorts of bits of their letters to each other that are really quite beautiful. Angela Carter is an author I love a lot, and they had deep reverence for each other's work. So anyway, when he comes up, I just love the idea that she gets to be on a panel really advocating for her friend's novel, not in a sort of riggery kind of way, but in a real sense of, I think, just deep reverence and love for his work. And maybe it actually started, I don't know, maybe their friendship started after this, I don't know. But essentially, Shame by Salman Rushdie, it comes 2 years after he won with Midnight's Children. This book that, you know, in many ways is this sort of pinnacle of Booker winners, right? It kind of, it won the Best of the Bookers for the 25-year anniversary. It won the Best of the Bookers for the 40-year anniversary, and then wasn't included in the one for the 50th, but probably would have won that. And it's a book that focuses on this sort of, in many ways, a lot of what Rushdie would do in many other books, sort of taking prominent political figures, particularly from India and Pakistan, and really kind of putting them through a lens of the absurd, the kind of playfulness of this. So we have a young character, a young boy, and he is, he doesn't really know who his father is. It's kind of a slightly Mamma Mia situation, but without Pierce Brosnan singing. Essentially, he is trying to sort of work out who his parents might be, and they are potentially, you know, the people potentially in the ring for this are these political figures. And so he kind of grows up in this sort of odd relationship with both political figures and with the world, because they could both be his parents and could be these people who are the parents of the nation. And there's a real sort of political allegory that kind of comes out of some parts of that. And particularly this book really looks at sort of divisions with India and Pakistan after partition, and kind of colonialism and various other things. And it does it very deftly. It's a very clever book, I think, in how it at times is very in your face about what it's doing, and at times just kind of lets it play out and has fun with what is being discussed. And so you've got this slightly fantastical, slightly unreal story going on, in a way that I really like with Rushdie, actually. I sometimes find him a bit tricky, but I think in Shame, something comes through that's really fun about the way he just sort of sets up these slightly fantastical situations that are never really quite true, but kind of just enjoys the playfulness of it maybe being true, right? Yeah, so it's kind of fun. And it's a book that really sort of keeps going towards these sort of various political points and kind of playing around with them. And it really then focuses on what this title shame means for characters in the book, that the deep shame that our young character at the heart of it, I keep on forgetting his name, Omar, feels. That shame leads to creating, he's almost a microcosm of wider political situations, right? So India and Pakistan, the political and global shame they feel with everything that's happened and sort of colonialism, that can create violence, that can create resentment and anger that leads to sort of political instability. Equally, Omar is in a similar situation. He feels so much shame about not really knowing who his parents were or his father was, that he becomes this slightly angry figure at times, and he kind of doesn't really know what to do. Meanwhile, you've got these sort of slightly bonkers characters around him. The fact that Omar as well, like, he doesn't really know who his mother is because there were 3 women who were pregnant around him, who were called Chani, Mani, and Bunny. And so that kind of gives you an idea of that absurdity, that we've got these slightly bonkers characters, but all of whom have real weight to them, but a real silliness to the kind of overall telling of the story. Something that I do enjoy about Rushdie quite a lot is it does feel like he's your granddad telling you a story and purposely kind of adding in all the fun bits because you're a kid, sort of being like, oh, and then, Chunny, Money, and Bunny all sat down and did this. There's this kind of sing-songy quality to it. So it's a really enjoyable book, and I see why it almost won. Even though for me, Life of Times of Michael Kay is my preferred book, I still think this is really interesting. And the way the vote went down for it was essentially that there were, 2 judges were dead set on Michael Kay, 2 judges were dead set on Shame, and there was a floating judge in between. To the extent where Shame was chosen as the winner, and then last minute, there was somebody, I think it was Faye Weldon actually, phoned through to say, actually, I've changed my mind. It's a different winner. It's going to be Life of Times of Michael Kay. So Shame very, very nearly won. And weird, it's kind of weird because actually in modern day times, we probably would have just given 2 wins here. I am kind of surprised that didn't happen here. But yeah, it's interesting nonetheless. And last but not least, we have Graham Swift with Waterland. And I actually personally would have chosen this as the runner-up winner in my dream version of this shortlist. I think I would have had Waterland competing for the top, and Shame is maybe a close third. Waterland largely focuses around a teacher who is trying to embed a sort of love for the local area in his students. And it's set in the Fens, which is in eastern England. It's sort of very it's kind of like swamp and bogland kind of thing. And so this Waterland that he talks about is this real reverence for part of the local land, the way that nature has made the land around them. But it also plays around with this because some parts of it are man-made and constructed, some parts of it are broken up by humans or reinstated by humans. And so this teacher, we're kind of largely in the mind of the teacher as he's teaching his students about the local land. We see how some people really don't care about what's happening and some students are really not that fussed. But more broadly, the way that this book kind of connects place and identity, I think, is really fascinating. That kind of this other part of the UK, Eastern England, that often kind of gets left out of a lot of conversations, is really the heart of this book. This book could not be set anywhere else in terms of the key story here, because of the way that eels and the Fenland are interact with the narrative style and what he's teaching. But what's also really interesting is we start to get a sense of something else breaking behind the scenes. So he has all these very long sort of speeches talking about the beauty and the power of the landscape, the way that the landscape has allowed these people to be who they are now. And he's trying to instate this sense of local pride. But I think what really seems to happen as well is that there's this sort of bigger bigger conversation about some really dark things happening. So there are things around potential theft of a baby. There are these conversations around um like around sort of trying to get pregnant and various other things. These really difficult life things are happening, but meanwhile our main character Tom is there trying to just tell these elaborate stories about the Fenland. And so kind of as we go, the murkiness of the landscape and the murkiness of the story intertwine in this really interesting way, where we start to think actually what's previously being described to us as this gorgeous land that feeds and protects is also the same thing that can hide a body, is the same thing that can be dark enough that murders could take place. You know, that it sort of almost reminds us that history cannot always be positive things. And so what is, I think, is so fascinating about this book is the way that it does this. It connects the dots in this really, really dark way. It's an incredibly dark book in many, many ways. And yet there's something so powerful about the way this book comes back to love of the land. We sort of at times see that it's kind of almost pointless, his love for the land. It's sort of it's so overwhelming that it's maybe disguising something else. We also see the kind of ways that by setting it in such a narrow place, you know, that this is the Fens, the east of England, we're all very proud to be from this area, but that's also a trap. These people, their histories, their stories, their lives are almost all contained within this place as well. And so there's almost feels like there's no getting away. And I think that's what this book achieves really incredibly, is this kind of claustrophobia of the book, some incredibly dark, tricky things happening, but yet there's no real escaping it. If this land is who you are, then what happens when you leave the land? Who are you? And I think it really plays with these ideas. I found this book really unnerving, but in a way where I just watched it happen and just thought, this is remarkable. Like I really love this. So for me, it's odd. I mean, I enjoyed Graham Swift's Winning book. For me, this is the significantly better book. And I would have given him the win for this, you know? Yeah, I think it's a fantastic, fantastic book. So that is the shortlist. Like I mentioned, I think some real standout books in this list. Some books that I didn't necessarily gel with in quite the same way. But for me, yeah, I think Waterland by Graham Swift or The Life and Times of Michael Kay by James Coetzee would be my personal favourites for the win. I think I think Shame is a fantastic sort of book as well in this. The other three I maybe didn't get on with in quite the same way. And I think it's interesting, the books that are kind of almost the darkest in this are probably the ones I liked most, and the most absurd books, which is normally what I lean towards. I don't think always necessarily paid off for me here. But there we go. It's a short list. You're never going to like all of them. Or if you do, it's rare. 2005, I'm looking at you. I think it's just it's some really interesting books. And again, I would never have read Waterland or any of these really, had it not been for the shortlist. So I feel very, very grateful in that respect. I hope you enjoy any of these books that you do check out. I do think they're all worth checking out in their own right. Take care and speak to you all soon. Bye-bye.